Welcome back as we continue our discussion and working with Azure AD Connect. In this module here, we're going to look at managing Active Directory users and groups within the Azure AD console, because we've been talking about the synchronization between Active Directory on-prem and Azure AD up in Office 365, but we really haven't toured the Azure AD interface. So what I want to do in this module is I want to take a look at four things. I want to look at managing users and groups from inside of the Azure AD console. I want to look at managing the Active Directory synchronization, and I want to talk about managing users, groups, and synchronization within PowerShell. You have to know more about PowerShell. PowerShell is the way to go because it allows us to create scripts and allows us to automate tasks, and that's what we want to do as much as possible. So first off, when we're looking at managing users in Azure AD, we've got a few things we can do. We can go in and add a user, and we have a couple ways we can do that from inside that interface. We can go into quick tasks, which we'll see when I go into the demo, or we can go over the users and groups. We can also display users a couple different ways. We can do so by locating them through the All Users interface, or we could use the Find a User to locate a specific user. Once we've located a user, we can configure their properties, and we can do so by using one of two ways: managing options or the profile. And at some point we may want to delete a user. Remember, this will be a soft delete, which means they'll go to recycle bin for 30 days, and after 30 days they'll be deleted out of that recycle bin. But we can do a hard delete by using a PowerShell command. So we're going to look at managing users in Azure AD. In addition to users, we may want to work with groups of users. So we need to talk about managing groups in Azure AD as well. We can add a group using quick tasks as well as users and groups, very similar to what we did with our users. We can display information about groups. We can look at all the groups, or we can locate a group. Again, very similar to what we did with our users. And we can configure group properties using manage options. And of course, we can delete a group, and they will also hang out for 30 days in the recycle bin. So we'll look at these as we go through the Azure Active Directory Admin Center interface. Now, when it comes to synchronizations, we have a couple categories of synchronizations. We have our default synchronization, which is a password, which means if I update a password, there's an immediate sync. But if I update any other object or attribute, it could be 30 minutes before I see that update. So remember, passwords immediate, other objects and attributes could be up to 30 minutes. I can manage synchronization a couple different ways. I can manage it through the Synchronization Service Manager. Now, when I say manage, really I'm limited in there because all I can do within the Synchronization Service Manager is force a synchronization. So if I just change multiple objects and I want to force a synchronization, I can do so through the Synchronization Service Manager. But if I want to modify any of my default sync settings, that can only be done via PowerShell. So we do have some control of the synchronization options, but with the default settings, those can only be changed from PowerShell. Well, speaking of PowerShell, we've got some PowerShell commands you need to be familiar with. We're going to walk through a few of these. The first one is the disable-AD sync export deletion threshold. That's a mouthful again. And we can enable it by swapping out the disable for enable. Remember I told you we can only delete 500 objects at a time. This allows us to override that limit that is set by default. We have a few other ones specific to the users and the groups and the contacts that you'll find in Active Directory. And we can use a get-msol user, a set-msol user, or remove-msol user. And you can use those same verbs with the contacts and the groups. We also have a start-AD sync cycle. If I don't want to wait the 30 minutes, which is our default sync cycle, I can use this command here to specify that I want to initiate a synchronization sooner. With this command, I'll specify the -policy type, and then I'll specify delta, which means I want just the changes, or I'll specify initial, which means I want to do a full synchronization. So an example would be start-AD sync cycle, space -policy type, space delta. Would be an example of how I would use that PowerShell command. We also have a verb-AD sync scheduler, which allows me to retrieve information about the current sync schedule and modify some of the options associated with the synchronization. And when you execute a get-AD sync scheduler, you're going to see a few items like this. The allowed sync cycle interval, which is the minimum interval allowed by Microsoft. Right now, that's 30 minutes. So I can modify how often the synchronization occurs, but I can't go less than 30 minutes. I can go higher, but I can't go lower. We also have the currently effective sync cycle interval. This is allowing me to get a view of what the current schedule is. We have the customize sync cycle interval. This is used to determine what the customized sync interval is if I'm not using the default 30 minutes. We have a next sync cycle policy type. This is going to tell me the next time the synchronization runs, is it running a delta or is it running a full, or initial is the actual keyword or parameter that we use with that. The purge run history interval. This allows me to see how long we're going to keep the logs associated with the synchronization. And we have a sync cycle enabled, and this tells me whether or not we're going to be running an import, a sync, or an export. We have the maintenance enabled option. This will display whether the maintenance process has been enabled. And we also have the sync cycle in progress, and this will tell me whether there's a sync actually occurring at this point in time. So this is information that will be returned using the get-AD sync scheduler. Some of these parameters can be modified with the set-AD sync scheduler to configure the synchronization. But as I mentioned, there are some limitations. For instance, the allowed sync cycle interval can't be less than 30 minutes.